Welcome back to another explainer. Today we are taking a really fascinating and entirely neutral look into a highly controversial esoteric text by Ryuho Okawa. This was recorded back on January 13, 2021, and it's called Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Now, what makes this text so absolutely compelling from a sociological standpoint is how it attempts to bridge these ancient mystical concepts of spiritual dualism with very real, very modern global crises. We're going to map out exactly how the author constructs this argument, looking directly at the source material to understand just how some new religious movements are interpreting geopolitics today.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to follow the book's narrative arc, moving from a massive cosmic problem identified in the preface all the way to a proposed survival solution in the afterword. We'll start with the pioneer of dualism, move on to cosmic dark forces today, then look at the blindness of material science, examine the claims around COVID-19 and media deception, and finish up with an urgent survival guide.
Section 1. The Pioneer of Dualism. Ancient Warnings for Modern Times. So, the entire foundation of this text is built upon a spiritual warning found right in the preface. The text allegedly channels the ancient prophet Zoroaster to deliver a message about our modern times. For those who might not know, Zoroaster is a massive historical figure whose teachings heavily influenced major global religions, while the text leverages that historical weight to set the stage for this epic cosmic battle. The author is basically using this ancient voice to establish a stark contrast that ends up framing every single argument made in the rest of the book.
To truly grasp the framework this book is using, we have to talk about dualism. Think of it as the religious and philosophical belief in two fundamental opposing forces. Good versus evil or light versus dark. The text essentially uses this binary lens to categorize literally all modern global affairs. Every political move, every tech advancement, every single crisis, it's all placed on one side of this cosmic scale.
Section 2. Cosmic Dark Forces Today. Ahriman's Return.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how an esoteric philosophy from thousands of years ago, it's applied to our modern geopolitical landscape today. As we can see from the table of contents, the text resurrects the ancient dark god known as Ahriman, and it maps this entity's interventions directly onto modern totalitarian regimes and dictatorships. It's a fascinating structural choice, taking a recognizable historical evil from Zoroastrianism and using it to explain the rise of contemporary authoritarianism.
The text argues that global conflicts are not merely political or economic disagreements. No, it frames them as literal spiritual wars. The author claims that dark cosmic entities and alien walk-ins, which are essentially extraterrestrial spirits that occupy human bodies, are actively influencing world leaders. By framing international relations this way, the text is attempting to give its readers a hidden, spiritual explanation for all those chaotic headlines we see in the news every day.
Section 3. Blindness of Material Science, the Modern Vulnerability.
So, if humanity is under attack by these cosmic forces, why are we so vulnerable to them? To diagnose this modern weakness, the author heavily critiques modern society. The text establishes this sharp contrast between spiritual awakening, representing the light, and materialistic science, which it tightly aligns with the darkness. According to the text, a pure reliance on the material world creates a kind of blindness. Because modern humans only believe in what they can see and touch, they are completely unaware of the spiritual manipulation happening right behind the scenes.
And the text gets highly specific about this, pointing its finger directly at modern tech monopolies like GAFA. That's Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. The book views our society's over-reliance on these scientific and tech giants not just as an economic monopoly or, a privacy issue. It views it as a deliberate spiritual trap set by those dark forces to control human perception. There's a translated quote here that perfectly summarizes the core of the book's diagnosis. It reads, "If you limit yourself only to this world, you can manipulate things, but you end up creating a structure where you are controlled by those with more convenient power." The crucial point the author is making here is that materialism strips humans of their true spiritual agency. It leaves them wide open to being manipulated by whoever controls the flow of information.
Section 4. COVID-19 and Media Deception. The Crisis Unfolds.
This theoretical framework leads us right into the concrete events of its time, specifically some highly controversial claims made in the afterword of the book. So how does an esoteric text about cosmic gods and ancient prophets explain a very real, very modern global pandemic? It bridges the abstract spiritual concepts we were just talking about directly into the geopolitical crisis of 2020 and 2021, using the pandemic as the ultimate proof of its theories.
The text makes several distinct and, again, highly controversial claims here. It alleges widespread media deception regarding the virus's origins, it jumps into the debate of natural occurrence versus bioweapon theories, it heavily criticizes the World Health Organization's investigations, and it claims that U.S. media narratives, especially surrounding the U.S. election, were actively masking the truth. The book frames the entire pandemic not just as a global health crisis, but as a direct manifestation of that cosmic battle between light and dark, with the media acting as literal agents of deception.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the afterword explicitly names the Wuhan origins, the WHO, and the media's treatment of the U.S. election. According to the text, the world's sheer inability to see the supposed truth behind these events is the ultimate, undeniable proof of that materialistic blindness it was warning us about earlier.
Section 5. An Urgent Survival Guide. The book's ultimate purpose.
Having laid out a pretty dire diagnosis of global affairs, the text finally pivots to a proposed solution for the reader. Because, despite the heavy focus on dark gods and global conspiracies, the book ultimately positions itself as a beacon of light. The text details how benevolent cosmic beings are actively offering guidance amidst the corona crisis. The author presents this channeled wisdom as a direct lifeline for humanity, a way to actually navigate the surrounding turmoil.
Ultimately, the main takeaway here is that the book functions as a spiritual survival manual. By utilizing the ancient framework of Zoroastrian dualism, the author is providing readers with a highly structured way to make sense of a world that feels completely overwhelming and chaotic. It offers a paradigm where breaking free from materialism isn't just a personal choice, it's framed as the ultimate victory against global totalitarianism. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating sociological question, right? As our global crises, whether we're talking pandemics, technology, or geopolitics, grow increasingly complex and difficult to understand, will we see more modern movements turning to the stark simplicity of ancient cosmic battles for their answers? It is a profound dynamic to observe. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into how esoteric texts map our modern world. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something seriously fascinating. We're unpacking a highly complex text called Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. It's this wild bridge between ancient theology and modern society. We're going to look at how this source takes cosmic spiritual battles and just blends them right into contemporary political philosophy in a way you've probably never seen before. So whether you're a political science buff, into theology, or just kind of curious about how different belief systems decode the modern world, this text offers a really unique framework.
Here's our primary source material for today. It's a book authored by Ryuho Okawa, and this specific session was recorded on January 13, 2021. The central premise here is, well, it's pretty grand. It frames our day-to-day earthly political struggles not just as, human conflicts, but as actual symptoms of a massive, universe-wide conflict between the forces of light and dark. It literally takes the headlines we see every single day and drops them right into the middle of a cosmic war.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the cosmic spiritual battle, move into invoking Zoroaster's spirit, examine democracy, specifically freedom versus equality, then we'll discuss exploiting result equality, and finally wrap up with Zoroaster's true spiritual lineage.
All right, Section 1, the cosmic spiritual battle.
To really grasp anything else in this text, we've got to understand the foundational lens the author is using. And that brings us to dualism. Basically, dualism is this philosophical or religious doctrine that the universe is fundamentally split by two totally opposed powers. Think good versus evil or light versus dark. But here's the kicker. The author asserts that this dualistic struggle isn't just some ancient mythology or abstract philosophy. According to the text, this is an active, ongoing cosmic war happening right now, and it's actively influencing human history and global politics. To unpack this cosmic war, the text reaches way back into history, specifically to Zoroaster. He was an ancient Persian prophet who lived around the 8th century BC. He's largely considered the original proponent of this whole dualistic paradigm. In his teachings, the universe is essentially a battleground between Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and Ahriman, the force of darkness. So the author invokes Zoroaster to help decode the modern world using this ancient binary lens.
Moving right along to Section 2, invoking Zoroaster's spirit.
This brings us to the, highly unconventional methodology of the book. The whole text is formatted as a spiritual message, claiming to channel the spirit of Zoroaster himself to uncover these hidden forces. And this channeled message puts forward this idea that human flaws and dark intentions aren't just isolated psychological hiccups. Instead, they act like a beacon. The text says, when one has evil intentions, there is something that comes from space in a corresponding manner. It leads to the darkness of the Ahriman system. So basically, when humans harbor wicked thoughts, they literally attract corresponding dark cosmic forces from space. It's framed as a symbiotic relationship between human frailty and cosmic intervention.
Next up, Section 3, Democracy, Freedom versus Equality.
Now, you might be wondering, how do these grand cosmic theories actually trickle down to earthly political systems? Like, how does a war between light and dark show up in modern government? Well, according to the text, the main battleground is democracy itself. The argument here is that over the last 200 to 250 years, the whole concept of democracy is fractured into two totally opposed ideological camps. On one side, you've got a democracy driven by the pursuit of freedom, which the book defines as providing motive and equal chances or opportunities, kind of like the original ideals of the American Revolution. But on the flip side, you have a democracy driven by the demand for equality, and very specifically, result equality or equal outcomes. The book uses this split to map that cosmic dualism right onto our political reality. It's suggesting these aren't just differing policies, but fundamentally opposed spiritual trajectories.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Exploiting Result Equality. This is where Chapter 1 issues its central flashing red light warning. It maps out this dangerous pipeline showing how dark forces actively exploit the concept of equality to steer democracy straight into totalitarianism. It goes like this. It starts with a public demand for absolute result equality. You know, the idea that everyone must end up in the exact same position, regardless of effort or chance. But to achieve that impossible standard, you need radical state intervention. That intervention inevitably leads to oppression, exploitation, and even mass casualties as the state tries to force compliance. And finally, the whole thing culminates in total totalitarianism. The text essentially argues that dark cosmic forces use the utopian promise of equality as a Trojan horse to establish authoritarian control right here on Earth.
The text actually distills this entire pipeline into one stark warning. Equality that has been brainwashed is dangerous. By mapping out the book's claims, we can see the author believes dark cosmic entities specifically exploit human idealism. They take a concept as universally appealing and noble as equality, twist it through brainwashing, and use it to steer democratic nations toward total control. It really is a fascinating look at how political extremism can be interpreted through a purely spiritual lens.
Let's move to our final part, Section 5, Zoroaster's True Spiritual Lineage. Chapter 1 culminates by attempting to reveal the ultimate truth behind Zoroaster's spiritual lineage. In the channel dialogue, a really pivotal question is posed to Zoroaster. They ask, who exactly was the god of light, Ahura Mazda, that you worshipped thousands of years ago? And this leads to a massive revelation, effectively attempting to unify multiple global theologies into one single cohesive cosmic structure.
Here's how the book synthesizes that big revelation. The entity known as Ahura Mazda in ancient Persia is revealed by the channeled spirit to actually be Elohim, the creator god recognized across the entire Middle East and in Judeo-Christian traditions. But wait, there's more. The text also claims that Elohim exists as a part of a single, supreme, overarching spiritual entity known in the author's theology as El Kantara. By doing this, the book neatly ties the ancient Persian dualistic battle, modern political struggles, and global religions all together under one massive, unified spiritual umbrella.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today, moving all the way from ancient Persian prophets to modern totalitarianism. It is a highly specific, very elaborate worldview for sure, but whether you view this text as literal spiritual truth or just as a fascinating piece of modern philosophical literature, it definitely leaves us with a compelling framework to ponder. If our earthly political movements are indeed influenced by a hidden cosmic war between light and dark, how does that change the way we evaluate the modern push for absolute equality? Does it make us look a little closer at the motives behind our political structures? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a source text that totally upends everything we think we know about the origins of our most influential ideas. If you've been following these topics with us, you know we like to dig deep, and what you're going to take away from this is a completely new framework for questioning the philosophies you consume every single day.
We're looking at a record of spiritual messages suggesting that human history isn't just shaped by brilliant minds, but by unseen cosmic forces. It's a wild lens to view human development through, so get ready to look at history from a strictly intergalactic perspective.
So think about this for a second. What if one of history's most famous philosophers was actually manipulated by a dark god of the universe? It's a massive premise. When we study philosophy, we usually credit groundbreaking ideas to the sheer genius, or maybe the madness, of the individual thinker. But the material we're analyzing today asks us to completely throw that assumption out the window. What if certain revolutionary, paradigm-shifting philosophies were actually planted, like deliberate interventions by forces totally outside of our world? It's a bold question, and honestly, it's the absolute core of what we're breaking down right now. The foundation for our explainer today is a published collection of spiritual interviews titled Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. This was recorded back on January 13, 2021. According to the spiritual messages documented in this text, the ancient teachings of the prophet Zoroaster have a way deeper, intergalactic context than standard history books will ever tell you. The book actually positions itself as a direct communication from Zoroaster himself, setting out to correct the historical record and warn all of us about an ancient cosmic conflict that is literally still playing out today.
Okay, Section 1. The Cosmic Battle Revealed, Beyond Earthly Origins. Specifically, if we look at Chapter 2, the source material dives deep into the actual methods of these earthly interventions. It claims that the entities attacking humanity aren't just your standard earthbound demons. No, we're talking about cosmic beings crossing time and space to plant heretical thoughts directly into our world. Forget the traditional heaven versus hell scenario confined just to Earth. This text paints a picture of a massive universe where dark forces travel across dimensions, and they aren't just trying to cause physical destruction. Their primary weapon is intellectual and spiritual manipulation. They're essentially hacking into the minds of influential earthly thinkers. Kinda chilling when you really think about it.
So who is the main antagonist here? The text points directly to Ahriman. Now, in traditional Zoroastrianism, you probably know Ahriman as the destructive spirit, but this source text expands that definition in a huge way. It describes Ahriman as a literal spacefaring entity, absolutely bent on confusing earthly doctrines. According to the book, Ahriman's signature go-to move is masquerading as a god or some kind of divine muse, whispering distorted ideas right into the ears of humanity's thought leaders. The goal isn't even necessarily to make people evil in the classic sense, but to make them arrogant, effectively isolating them from genuine divine guidance.
Moving on to Section 2, Hijacking Friedrich Nietzsche, the Zarathustra Distortion.
This is where things get incredibly specific. The source text presents a spiritual interview with Zoroaster, and he is expressing some deep frustration about being completely misrepresented by the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. You all know Nietzsche famously wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Zarathustra is just another name for Zoroaster. In that book, the character is used to declare that God is dead and to introduce the Übermensch, or Superman concept. Well, our source claims the real Zoroaster is seriously aggrieved by this. It states that Nietzsche completely hijacked his name to promote an ideology that is the exact, literal opposite of what the true Zoroaster stood for. And this quote from the text brilliantly captures the severity of the claim. Reality is the exact opposite. Because of this sin of making me a Superman, Nietzsche has fallen to hell. The text argues that Nietzsche's famous writings weren't just edgy philosophy, they were a direct manipulation by Ahriman, which had disastrous spiritual consequences for Nietzsche himself. Think about the strategy here. By having a famous philosopher use the name of a great prophet to spread anti-religious ideas, Ahriman scores a massive victory. The text reports bluntly that because Nietzsche let his intellect be weaponized to create this Superman illusion, he met a tragic spiritual fate. It totally recontextualizes one of history's most debated figures. Section 3. Correcting the record, the true Zoroaster versus the Superman. When you lay the two side by side, the contrast between the earthly philosophical icon and the spiritual reality the book presents is just stark. On one side, you have Nietzsche's version, a philosophy championing ultimate human self-reliance, rejecting objective morality, and elevating the self into the Superman. But then on the flip side, you have the source text version of the actual Zoroaster, a prophet who vehemently opposes human arrogance, teaching instead that humanity absolutely must rely on the god of light, Ahura Mazda, if they want to successfully fight off dark cosmic forces. The text frames Nietzsche's work not just as bad philosophy, but as a deliberate, calculated inversion of a sacred truth.
Impartially speaking, the source views the Übermensch as a deliberate cosmic sabotage. The logic is actually incredibly structured when you break it down. If you can convince humanity that they are their own gods, that they are these supermen, they'll naturally cut themselves off from true divine protection. By pushing extreme intellectual arrogance, Ahriman isolates human souls, leaving them completely vulnerable to cosmic manipulation. According to the material we're explaining today, the philosophy of the Superman is essentially the ultimate trap. Why does this matter for us? Well, it suggests that what we often celebrate as ultimate self-empowerment might actually be our greatest vulnerability.
Section 4. Ancient Gods and Cosmic Origins, Tracing the Dark Lineage.
Now, this manipulation obviously didn't just start in the 19th century with Nietzsche. The source traces this dark influence way further back. The text links these cosmic interventions all the way back to the ancient Sumerian pantheon, showing a distinct lineage of corruption over generations. It suggests that Ahriman's influence is a long-term, calculated campaign deeply embedded in human civilization since our earliest recorded myths. The book essentially does an audit of the ancient gods, tracing how light and truth were systematically diluted and corrupted over millennia by these intervening forces.
The text gives us a step-by-step breakdown mapping out exactly how divine concepts were hijacked. It starts with Anu, who the text recognizes as a legitimate early god. But by the second generation, with Enlil, we start to see this mixture of good and evil creeping in. Then, by the third generation, with an entity known as Belial, the text claims the lineage just completely deteriorated into madness and dark alignment. And that eventually led to the widespread worship of Baal across the ancient Middle East. The source is using this lineage to prove a crucial point. Cosmic manipulation is patient, it's generational, and it is brutally effective at turning humanity away from the light.
So we're going to wrap up this explainer by leaving you to ponder a pretty profound implication. If the claims in this source text hold true, if forces like Ahriman are actively reaching across the cosmos right now to plant ideas in the minds of our most celebrated thinkers, it forces us to completely reevaluate the history of human thought. Are our biggest cultural shifts and philosophical breakthroughs really the result of human ingenuity? Or are we, essentially, just the battlefield for an ancient, intergalactic war of ideas? It's a gripping perspective, and one that definitely makes you look a lot closer at the origins of the ideas governing our world today.
Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. We are jumping right into a genuinely unorthodox, completely fascinating view of human history today. We're going to break down the really bold claims made in Chapter 3 of Ryuho Okawa's book, Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Now, this was originally recorded on January 13, 2021, and the text argues something wild. It proposes that humanity is, and pretty much always has been, the target of a massive spiritual battle. The idea is that dark space forces have been pulling the strings behind the scenes using science, technology, and a very specific mindset to just exert total control over us. It's a huge narrative, so let's dive right into how this whole strategy comes together.
To kick things off, we really have to ask ourselves a crucial question. What on earth could possibly link the mythological Garden of Eden, the horrors of World War II eugenics, and modern social media censorship? I mean, on the surface, these are totally unrelated things, right? You've got ancient myth, incredibly dark 20th century history, and today's digital politics. But in this text, these aren't just random, isolated events. They are actually stitched together into one continuous, unbroken narrative of cosmic intervention. To really get what the author is saying, we have to look at how these totally different eras are basically just distinct phases of one master plan.
So the whole premise of the book rests on this idea that humanity is caught in a literal, active battle against dark space forces. It takes the ancient dualism of Zoroastrianism, that classic battle between light and darkness, good and evil, and completely updates it for the space age. The dark god in this book isn't some metaphor or a psychological concept. The text treats this entity and the forces working with it as literal cosmic actors actively messing with Earth, and their ultimate goal? To systematically completely sever humanity's connection to the divine.
Okay, before we go any further, we absolutely need to redefine a word we use every single day, and that word is materialism. The book doesn't use materialism to mean, wanting the newest smartphone or buying a luxury car. Instead, it describes materialism as a deliberate philosophical weapon. It's essentially a psychological trap meticulously set by these dark forces to make humans believe that absolutely nothing exists outside the physical world. Think about it. If you can convince an entire population that there's no spiritual realm, no afterlife, nothing divine, well, they become incredibly easy to control using purely physical and technological means.
And that brings us right to the meat of Chapter 3, which is actually titled Control Using Materialism and Scientific Technology. This is the core strategy. This dark control is rarely brute force. Actually, it's a slow, methodical grind using the advancement of science and technology over thousands of years, all paired with that materialistic philosophy we just talked about. The chapter outlines how these cosmic forces introduce concepts that look like amazing human progress, real game changers, but are allegedly designed to just bind us closer to the physical earth and pull us away from spiritual freedom.
So how does this actually play out over time? Well, it happens in 3 massive steps. We start way back, around 4000 BC with ancient Sumeria and the Eden myth. Then, we take a huge leap to the mid-20th century, zooming in on the horrific pseudoscience of World War II. And finally, the thread pulls us right into the 21st century, pointing straight at big tech and the digital world. The argument here is that while the methods change drastically, from ancient myths to modern smartphones, the endgame of enslaving humanity stays exactly the same.
Section 1. Ancient Interventions, the Genetic Experiments of Eden.
You know the traditional story of Adam and Eve? We'll throw that right out the window. According to the claims in this book, that story from Mesopotamia was actually a record of extraterrestrials creating alien human hybrids. The narrative proposes that advanced beings landed on Earth and realized their original bodies just weren't suited for the environment here. So to fix this biological problem, they supposedly started doing radical genetic crossbreeding. They took early hominids and spliced them with their own DNA to engineer a hybrid race. In this view, Eden wasn't some magical, divine garden. It was literally a high-tech extraterrestrial laboratory. Now put yourself in the shoes of an ancient human for a second. You don't have words like DNA, cloning, or genetic splicing. How would you possibly describe a high-tech medical procedure? The book posits that ancient accounts of gods making humans out of clay or putting a man to sleep to pull out a rib to make a woman were just ancient people trying their best to document advanced genetic experiments. Getting taken to a sky god's realm or being operated on was recorded through the only lens they had, ancient mythology. It's a really wild reframing of theology into ancient astronaut theory.
Section 2. The 20th Century Escalation, Eugenics and the Master Race.
Now we take a startling and honestly horrifying leap forward in time. The text claims that Hitler's eugenics programs were directly guided by a dark cosmic entity named Ahriman. Now, Ahriman is traditionally a figure from Zoroastrianism that represents evil, but here he's framed as an active, highly intelligent extraterrestrial presence. The book suggests this intelligence deliberately manipulated the Nazi regime to use pseudoscience to literally engineer a specific type of human. It echoes those ancient genetic experiments of Eden, but this time weaponized for dictatorial purpose on a global scale.
The text frames this whole era as a stark, epic clash of ideals. On one side, you have spiritual freedom represented by Zoroaster's light, which is all about the soul, individuality, and a connection to the divine. On the flip side is materialistic control, driven by Ahriman's dark tech. By pushing humanity toward eugenics and treating people like mere biological machines to be bred and categorized, these dark forces were basically trying to erase the very concept of a soul. Because if humans believe we're just meat and genetics, spiritual freedom is gone and totalitarian control becomes a whole lot easier.
Section 3. The 21st Century Battlefield. Big Tech as Digital Enslavement.
So if ancient myths were phase 1 and 20th century eugenics was phase 2, where does that leave us today? Well, the book points a massive finger straight at modern big tech. It specifically groups the major players into the acronym GAFA: Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. The text describes these colossal entities as the newest tools for this dark, materialistic control. Most of us just see these platforms as super convenient services, right? But from this cosmic perspective, they are deliberate mechanisms designed to monopolize our attention, dictate our reality, and trap our consciousness entirely inside a physical, digital box.
What this means is that things like algorithmic control and digital censorship aren't just seen as corporate content moderation. The author views them as literal, cosmic, spiritual warfare. The text actually cites controlling massive follower bases as a form of mass hypnosis. It also points to the silencing and banning of prominent political figures, specifically bringing up Donald Trump on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, as proof that tech companies are acting as unaccountable rulers of public discourse. Ultimately, the book argues the real goal here is to completely erase spiritual or dissenting thought from the public square.
There's a quote in the text that just hits the nail on the head. Because this world is all there is, it can be tinkered with, and science can rule. This right here is the ultimate catastrophic danger of the materialism we defined earlier. If these tech platforms and the unseen forces allegedly behind them can convince you that absolutely nothing exists beyond the physical world, then humans just become biological data points. We become things to be tinkered with, optimized, and ruled by algorithms. The book presents this as a profound loss of our humanity, completely disguised as technological progress.
Connecting the deep past to our immediate future, the text warns that this ancient genetic meddling is culminating right in front of our eyes. The book explicitly warns about the rapid rise of AI, cyborgs, and artificial human manipulation. It particularly notes authoritarian regimes that are supposedly developing artificial soldiers. The argument is that these dark forces have leveled up. They went from tinkering with DNA in ancient times to biological engineering in the 20th century, and now they are aiming for total technological integration, creating perfectly obedient humans completely severed from anything divine.
When you connect all these massive dots, this explainer reveals a worldview where absolutely nothing is an accident. The mythological Garden of Eden, the horrors of the 1940s, and that highly curated social media feed you scroll through every single day, they are all deeply tied together. In this framework, technology is consistently weaponized by unseen forces. It is one single, unbroken narrative of cosmic control. Materialism is the cage, and scientific technology is the lock designed to keep us trapped inside.
Now, regardless of whether you buy into this literal cosmic battle, we have to pause and ask ourselves a pretty massive question. Why do these grand, sweeping theories that blend ancient mythology with modern tech resonate so deeply with us right now? Maybe it's just human nature. In a world where technology is moving way faster than our ethics and a handful of tech giants control global communication, we are all just desperately looking for structure and maybe trying to identify the forces at play in an incredibly unpredictable world. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning everything, and I'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. Today we are looking at something absolutely fascinating. We're unpacking a text that takes a wildly unexpected lens to the geopolitical tensions we see in the news every single day. The source we're exploring argues that our modern political systems aren't just the result of human history or economics, but are actually earthly reflections of a massive, ongoing cosmic battle. It's a bold, highly theoretical framework for sure, and our goal today is to break down exactly how this text constructs its argument, step by step.
Okay. Let's dive into this, because this is the massive, macro-level question that the source material asks us to consider. What if the ideological struggle between free, democratic societies and highly controlled, totalitarian regimes isn't just a human invention? What if these are manifestations of cosmic forces actively competing for influence? It's a huge concept, and it completely forces us to look at the daily news through a totally different, almost mythological lens.
The ideas we're exploring come directly from a source text titled Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe, which was recorded on January 13, 2021. Now, as an explainer, we aren't here to endorse the theological claims made in this text. We're just impartially mapping out its unique architecture. Specifically, we're going to focus heavily on Chapter 4, titled The Struggle Between Light and Darkness Behind the Battle of Democracy and Totalitarianism. The author presents this incredibly unique, top-down spiritual explanation for how and why extreme political control takes root here on Earth.
Section 1. The Cosmic Political Battle. As above, so below. To really grasp the author's view on modern politics, we first have to understand the cosmic framework being proposed.
At the absolute core of the text is this fundamental duality. On one side, we have the forces of light, which the source aligns with democracy, free will, and the flourishing of individuality. And on the flip side, we have the forces of darkness, which are mapped directly onto totalitarianism, the suppression of free thought, and strict uniformity. The book argues that whenever a state tries to force total uniformity on its citizens, it's quite literally acting as an agent for these darker cosmic forces.
Section 2. Defining totalitarianism. The elimination of dissent. So how does this cosmic darkness actually manifest down here on Earth?
Well, the source doesn't just look at the modern era. It traces this battle as a cyclical, historical reality. It points to cosmic interventions dating back over 4,800 years, specifically noting clashes between forces like Metatron and Ahriman, and it maps this right onto human conflicts. For instance, it highlights the stark contrast in ancient Greece between the strict, militant control of Sparta and the vibrant, free-thinking, democratic ideals of Athens. The author then traces this push and pull forward through the bloody clashes of the French Revolution, all the way to the rise of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. So according to this timeline, totalitarianism isn't just a modern glitch in the system, it's an ancient, recurring blueprint.
And what is the ultimate goal of that blueprint? The text defines it with chilling simplicity. It states that in these systems, quote, other thoughts are not allowed, and dissenting opinions are not permitted. The author argues that the absolute essence of earthly darkness is the complete elimination of diversity in thought, essentially trying to force millions of unique individuals into a single, unyielding, and easily controllable mold.
Section 3. Materialism and Efficiency, the Path to Control. This brings us to a really practical question. How do vibrant human societies actually slide into this level of absolute control?
According to Chapter 4 of our source, the trap is set through two very modern obsessions: extreme materialism and the pursuit of ultimate efficiency. The text argues that when a society completely adopts extreme materialism, the belief that only the physical, tangible world exists, totally rejecting the spiritual, it ironically opens the door to total domination. Because if people believe they're nothing more than physical matter, well, they can be managed, processed, and controlled purely through scientific and technological means.
Building on that materialism, the source notes that absolute state control is rarely ever sold to the public as something evil. Instead, it's almost always justified under the guise of ultimate societal efficiency. If the state is viewed as this massive, finely tuned machine, then individual free will is just friction that slows the whole thing down. To achieve perfect scientific management of a population, that freedom has to be systematically stripped away.
Section 4. The AI surveillance state, technological totalitarianism. Which brings us right to the present day. The text argues that we're currently witnessing the most advanced form of this cosmic control in human history.
In partially looking at the source's contemporary examples, the book specifically points to the explosive rise of modern surveillance states. It claims that systems utilizing relentless AI camera monitoring, facial recognition, and constant digital tracking are creating what it calls a brainwashed state. The core argument here is fascinating. When citizens know they're being monitored by an all-seeing artificial intelligence every single second of the day, they begin to self-censor. They ultimately crush their own free will before the state even has to intervene. And if the state doesn't even have to intervene because you're policing your own thoughts, do you truly have free will anymore?
The author actually lays out a very precise four-step sequence of societal degradation. Step 1 is the embrace of extreme materialism. This leads directly to Step 2, the rejection of spiritual individuality. That creates a moral and structural vacuum for Step 3, where AI and centralized management step in to organize society. And finally, we arrive at Step 4, the complete and utter loss of human freedom. It is quite literally a step-by-step roadmap to technological totalitarianism.
Section 5. Humans as cyborgs. The ultimate loss of free will.
And what happens at the end of that roadmap?
To describe the tragic final state of humanity under this kind of absolute control, the source uses a highly visual and honestly pretty surprising pop culture metaphor. It compares the citizens of these ultimate totalitarian regimes to the Imperial stormtroopers in Star Wars. Clad in uniform pure white, completely devoid of personal identity, simply following orders from a central command. The text claims this isn't just a movie trope, it is the literal desire of the dark cosmic forces to manage humanity as a faceless, uniform army where every single soldier is identical.
So the crucial point is this final, striking warning. Under a system of absolute efficiency, relentless AI surveillance, and pure materialism, human beings cease to be truly human. According to Chapter 4 of the text, they are reduced to robotic cyborgs. They become biological machines, stripped entirely of the free will, individuality, and creative thought that defines the forces of light.
Whether you view this text as literal spiritual truth or simply as a fascinating philosophical metaphor, the underlying tension is incredibly relevant today. It leaves us with a really critical question to consider. As we continue to build more complex, AI-driven societies in our relentless pursuit of ultimate efficiency, what boundaries must we set to protect our individuality, our dissent, and ultimately our free will? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.
All right, let's jump right in. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking a totally fascinating and honestly highly unusual intersection of esoteric spiritual belief and modern geopolitical anxiety. We're looking at a text that takes very real, incredibly complex global power dynamics and filters them through the lens of a literal cosmic war. It's a wild ride for sure. We're going to objectively break down exactly what this text is claiming step by step so you can really understand the architecture of this incredibly unique theory. Our source material for this explainer is Ryuho Okawa's book, Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Now, right off the bat, I want to make something absolutely crystal clear. We are here to impartially analyze the author's highly abstract allegations. We aren't taking political sides here, and we certainly aren't validating these claims as objective reality. Instead, we're exploring the text itself to see how the author constructs this sprawling narrative about global power dynamics, using esoteric and supernatural frameworks to try and explain the shifting landscape of our world. To make sense of all this dense material, here's our game plan. First, the Zoroaster spiritual messages. Second, defining a walk-in. Third, Xi Jinping's personality shift. Fourth, the AI surveillance state. And finally, the 2027 power shift. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Zoroaster spiritual messages. The specific source material we're unpacking today originated from a recording made on January 13, 2021. The text frames itself as a collection of spiritual messages. Essentially, it attempts to channel the ancient Zoroastrian concepts of light versus dark, bringing that ancient dualistic theology directly into the modern era to explain current events. You see, the author isn't just writing a standard political analysis. The text is presented as an esoteric revelation about a literal cosmic battle happening right behind the scenes of global politics. Moving right along to Section 2, defining a walk-in. To understand the core claims in Chapter 5, we really need to unpack this critical piece of jargon. So the author uses this really fascinating, almost sci-fi-esque mechanism to explain rapid, otherwise inexplicable shifts in human behavior. According to the text, a walk-in is a phenomenon where a cosmic, alien, or spiritual consciousness forcibly enters a human body that is already alive, effectively hijacking the original person's soul. It's like a hostile takeover of a human being. The book uses this abstract supernatural concept as the literal vehicle for how dark cosmic entities intervene in earthly political affairs without anyone noticing. And the rationale presented in the book is actually highly pragmatic, from a cosmic villain's perspective. It explicitly compares this process to the Hollywood movie Avatar. The logic goes like this. If a dark entity wants to seize power on Earth, being born as a baby and waiting 50 or 60 years to slowly climb the political ladder is just way too slow and inefficient. Instead, they use the walk-in method to immediately take over the living body of someone who already holds massive political power. It's essentially an esoteric shortcut to global domination. That brings us to Section 3, Xi Jinping's personality shift. Let's look at how this abstract definition turns into a very specific allegation. In Chapter 5, the text absolutely does not leave the walk-in concept in the realm of theory. It applies it directly to the president of China. The source states, and I quote, "He was clearly walked in. After he became president, his personality changed." The crucial takeaway here is that the author is using this supernatural hijacking theory as the direct explanation for Xi Jinping's observed shift towards stricter authoritarianism. The book makes the outright allegation that the political changes in China aren't just normal policy decisions. They're the result of a dark cosmic soul literally taking the wheel of the country's leadership. Now, what elevates this from a purely spiritual claim is an incredibly surprising detail found later in the chapter. The text asserts that even circles within American military intelligence are aware of these walk-in experiments. According to the source, the U.S. military is supposedly investigating this phenomenon and treating this cosmic hijacking as a serious, credible threat to global security. It's a really fascinating narrative choice by the author, attempting to anchor an entirely supernatural concept right within the very real world of military intelligence and geopolitical paranoia. All right, Section 4, the AI surveillance state. How exactly does this supposedly hijacked leadership govern? The source frames this entire situation as a massive clash of ideologies, stemming from that ancient Zoroastrian battle of light versus dark. On one side, you have the concepts of democracy and freedom. On the other, the text describes the methodology of the dark god as relying entirely on AI totalitarianism and materialism. From this perspective, the dark cosmic forces inherently reject spiritual freedom. And because of that, their earthly regimes have to rely completely on material, technological control to maintain their iron grip on power. The text points directly to modern China as the ultimate manifestation of this. It describes a system relying on constant, ubiquitous camera surveillance and non-stop algorithm checks. The author observes that the regime is replacing traditional concepts of freedom with an incredibly efficient, AI-driven apparatus designed to manage the entire population. The source goes so far as to call the end result of this relentless technological surveillance a brainwashing state, where independent thought is just systematically managed right out of existence. The author actually coins a specific term for this: AI totalitarianism. The text posits that the walk-in entity uses artificial intelligence as the ultimate tool for absolute earthly control. Why? Well, because machines don't have human empathy. The source claims that human managers of this system eventually just give up on compassion because the machine is so rigidly unforgiving. Interestingly, the text even includes a specific detail alleging that Xi Jinping's daughter is deeply involved in pushing forward this AI-managed society. Whether that detail is true or not, it really shows how the author weaves specific, real-world figures into this massive, sweeping narrative of technological subjugation. And finally, Section 5, the 2027 Power Shift. We've seen the tools. Now, what's the ominous prediction for our future? The author lays out a very specific and highly accelerated timeline for a global crisis. The text notes that originally, experts might have projected a shift in power between the US and China to culminate somewhere around the year 2050, perhaps starting to become visible around 2024. However, the author insists that this timeline has completely changed. Because of the aggressive nature of the alleged walk-in leadership, the timeline for a definitive US-China power swap has been radically accelerated. The source text presents a deeply alarming scenario here. It predicts that by around the year 2027, which is just a few short years away from when this was recorded in 2021, China will completely overtake the United States in virtually all aspects of global power. The author asserts that under this super aggressive timeline, the regime driven by this cosmic walk-in will achieve total global dominance, fundamentally ending the era of American supremacy. So, to summarize the core thesis of Chapter 5, the author is arguing that you simply cannot understand modern geopolitics just by looking at trade deals or military budgets. According to this text, behind the veil of AI development and shifting global superpowers lies a literal, ongoing cosmic battle. The ultimate war, in the author's view, isn't just a political struggle between nations. It is a fundamental spiritual war against a dark god, attempting to enforce AI totalitarianism on all of humanity. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. But before we go, I want to leave you with a question to really think about. Regardless of what you make of walk-ins or cosmic battles, it's undeniable that the real-world political shifts happening right now are massive and frankly a bit intimidating. So why do you think human beings, even today, in our modern, highly technological era, are increasingly drawn to using supernatural, cosmic, or spiritual lenses to explain these complex, terrifying political realities? Is it just our way of making sense of a world that's moving faster than we can comprehend? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep seeking to understand the ideas shaping our world. Welcome, everyone, to today's explainer. We are jumping straight into a truly fascinating and honestly quite unconventional text recorded back on January 13th, 2021. Today, we're going to impartially unpack the highly unique claims about geopolitics, theology, and human consciousness found in Ryuho Okawa's book, Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Looking right here at the cover, you get a sense of the premise. The entire book is presented as a channeled, spiritual interview with the ancient spirit of Zoroaster himself. And, well, what does this ancient figure have to say about our modern world? According to the text, we are literally in the middle of an ongoing cosmic battle between the forces of light and a deeply manipulative dark god. So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The cosmic battle. 2. Identifying the dark god. 3. Spiritual roots of communism. 4. Mechanisms of mind control. And finally, 5. Repelling spiritual possession. Let's dive right in. Section 1. The cosmic battle, light versus dark. That brings us to our first absolutely crucial definition. Meet Ahriman. In this text, Ahriman is the name given to the dark god of the universe. And according to this narrative, Ahriman isn't just some abstract metaphorical concept of evil, you know? He's presented as an active cosmic entity who allegedly intervenes directly in Earth's affairs. His primary goal? To spread totalitarianism and completely strip humanity of its spiritual freedom. The book actually attributes major human political movements directly to the influence of this specific cosmic being. Moving on to Section 2, Mechanisms of Influence, How Earth is Manipulated. Okay, so the crucial piece of the puzzle here is understanding this specific term, walk-in. The text uses walk-in to describe a very literal form of spiritual possession. It's defined as a direct intervention by extraterrestrial or dark spiritual entities who basically enter and control human minds, and by extension, human ideologies. I want to demystify this jargon right out of the gate, because understanding walk-ins is the absolute central mechanism the text uses to explain the actions of various global leaders. It's wild stuff, but it's the core of the book's argument. As you can see in this excerpt, the text firmly asserts that these walk-ins are an active method of mind control, carried out by earthbound demons or even space entities. So, the source material views massive global political shifts not as mere policy changes or human error, but as the direct result of human minds being hijacked by external dark spiritual forces. Which brings us to Section 3, Spiritual Roots of Communism, Spiritual Vulnerability. Now we're getting into Chapter 6, which is ominously titled The True Identity of What Lurks Behind Communism. This is where the book completely shifts the paradigm of how we usually discuss geopolitics. It categorizes communism not just as a socioeconomic or political system, but as a literal tool for spiritual possession. According to the author, it's an ideology specifically designed to reject the divine, which basically opens the front door for Ahriman's influence. To put that into perspective, the text firmly equates materialism with mind control and the active rejection of God. On the other side, spiritualism is championed as the source of true freedom and equality, acknowledging humans as children of God. The argument here is that when a society embraces materialism, it creates this massive spiritual blind spot, and that blind spot directly invites and allows for dark cosmic influence to just walk right in. When you apply this framework to history, it yields highly unconventional interpretation. Take historical figures like Lenin and Stalin. They aren't just viewed as dictators here. The text claims they are literal heroes to these dark extraterrestrial spiritual forces. Similarly, modern elite societies, which the book sees as entirely driven by materialism, are considered highly susceptible to being controlled by these exact same forces today. And we're not exaggerating this point. The text explicitly states that figures like Lenin and Stalin were remarkably successful in destroying spiritual structures, which is exactly why the dark forces revere them as heroes. We are impartially reporting exactly what is on the page here, and it is undeniably a dramatic reimagining of history. All right, Section 4, Mechanisms of Mind Control, Spreading the Ideology. So, how does this spread? Well, the text makes the incredibly bold claim that education at the world's most elite global universities essentially equates to brainwashing. The author specifically calls out top-tier institutions, mentioning places like Tokyo University or Tsinghua University in China as epicenters for materialistic indoctrination. The argument is that by intensely focusing only on the material world and hyper-competitiveness, these schools completely shut down a person's spiritual senses. In fact, the author pulls no punches. Quote, it's brainwashing. Even if they take a competitive exam and get a good score, what they are doing is crazy. The book asserts that strict adherence to modern educational paradigms, which are heavily materialistic, isn't a sign of intelligence at all. Rather, it's a symptom of profound spiritual manipulation. Let's move to our final section, Section 5, Repelling Spiritual Possession, Fighting Back. To fight back against all this, the text outlines several key defenses. We've got religious prayer, the power of thought, faith in God, Bushido, which is the traditional way of the warrior, and diverse values. It's honestly fascinating how it beautifully blends universal religious practices with deeply specific Japanese martial philosophy to create what is essentially comprehensive spiritual armor. And it gets even more specific. The text actually makes the surprising claim that certain contemporary world leaders, specifically mentioning Vladimir Putin in one context, are able to resist being completely taken over by walk-ins precisely because they maintain a foundational faith in God and adhere to rigid codes akin to Bushido. Regardless of what you think of that, it's certainly a fascinating way to map spiritual differences directly onto modern geopolitics. But perhaps the most applicable defense for everyday society is the maintenance of diverse values. The text strongly emphasizes that when a society forces everyone to think exactly the same way, which is usually a materialistic way, it becomes incredibly easy for totalitarian thought control and dark cosmic forces to take root. Diversity of thought is literal protection. Ultimately, the core takeaway from this incredibly complex source material is this: active spiritual practice, unwavering faith, and, crucially, the active protection of diverse thought act as a literal, functional shield against cosmic dark forces. For the author, it's not just about politics. It's about actively fortifying your own mind. Which leaves us with this final provocative question.
Does framing political ideology not just as a debate over policy, but as a literal, cosmic, spiritual battle change how we view the power of diverse values? Regardless of your personal beliefs, this text absolutely challenges us to see the preservation of spiritual freedom and diverse thought as the ultimate defense mechanism for humanity. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly mind-bending text, Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Specifically, we're diving deep into a fascinating lecture recorded back on January 13, 2021. It asks a pretty wild question. What if modern geopolitical conflicts aren't just about borders or economics, but are actually reflections of an ancient cosmic battle between light and darkness? Well, let's get right into it. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The trap of totalitarianism, 2. Hitler and Stalin, 3. Churchill's decision, and 4. Breaking the propaganda.
We're zeroing in exclusively on Chapter 7, which is titled How to Decide the Battle of Light and Darkness. Now, forget standard political science for a second, because what the author does here is highly unusual and honestly, incredibly captivating. This chapter forces us to look at 20th century geopolitics, events we usually view strictly through the lens of economics or territory, through a very specific cosmic and dualistic lens. It completely shifts the paradigm of how we understand global conflict.
Section 1. The Trap of Totalitarianism.
To start us off, the author presents a really provocative thesis about the true nature of extreme political control. The text essentially argues that extreme political spectrums eventually merge into the exact same dark desire for total domination. Think of it like a political horseshoe, right? When you look at the absolute extremes, whether that's the far right or the far left, the underlying mechanics of totalitarianism become practically identical. The defining characteristic isn't the specific economic policy or the social rhetoric. Instead, it just boils down to the dictator's overwhelming, insatiable desire to control every single aspect of human life and completely erase individual will.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's concept of the invisible army. See, when a totalitarian regime takes hold, it systematically strips the populace of independent thought. People literally stop being neighbors with unique values, distinct personalities, and individual morals. Instead, they morph into this terrifying uniform mass. The text describes this as a faceless, invisible army. It's a society transformed into a singular weapon, ready to follow absolutely any command without a single shred of moral hesitation.
But here's where it gets wild. According to the text, there is a sinister cosmic mechanic at play behind this transformation. It suggests that as a dictator's desire for absolute control grows, that massive ego acts like a powerful beacon. Unseen, dark cosmic forces enter our sphere to help them build this faceless, obedient army using mass propaganda and fear. So the dictator provides the earthly ambition, and these unseen forces step in to provide the psychological mechanics necessary to totally brainwash the masses.
Section 2. Hitler and Stalin.
Now, the author doesn't just lump all dictators together into one bucket. Instead, he frames the distinct influences behind these two historical figures quite differently. The text categorizes the unseen dark space beings backing Adolf Hitler as being highly tech-focused. They brought a cold, calculated, clinical, and almost robotic obsession with genetic supremacy and scientific warfare. But in stark contrast, Joseph Stalin's influences are described as being rooted in an overwhelming tidal wave of brute force, raw, chaotic energy, and sheer physical numerical expansion.
The text actually goes a step further here, explicitly categorizing these dictators by their distinct extraterrestrial and occult backing. The author notes that while both represent immense forces of darkness, they were operating on completely different frequencies. One was driven by an icy obsession with materialistic perfection and technological superiority, while the other relied on crushing numerical suppression. Understanding these distinct tactics, the scientific approach versus the brute force approach, is absolutely key to grasping the author's entire framework for how these dark forces manipulate humanity on such massive scales.
Section 3. Churchill's decision.
So, if these dictators represent the ultimate forces of darkness in this cosmic battle, how does the text analyze the counterforce? Well, a crucial point is this powerful juxtaposition the author makes between the principle of politics and the principle of journalism. Think about the pure ideals of journalism for a second. It operates on absolute transparency, the quest for complete truth, and pure, unfiltered justice. Now contrast that with the grim, gritty reality of politics during an existential fight for survival. Politics requires a harsh, pragmatic calculus. When you're facing total annihilation, idealism often has to take a back seat to sheer national interest and pragmatic survival tactics.
Imagine holding the ultimate secret. You have successfully cracked the enemy's unbreakable code. Winston Churchill had exactly this with the Enigma machine during World War II. But to protect that incredible advantage, he had to make agonizing, purely pragmatic choices. Sometimes this meant allowing devastating attacks to happen without warning the targets. Why? Because if he reacted, the enemy would instantly know the code was broken and that strategic advantage would be lost forever. This is the text's ultimate example of the harsh principle of politics. To defeat a dark, invisible army, the forces of light sometimes just have to make incredibly heavy, painful sacrifices that pure, untainted idealism simply wouldn't allow.
Which brings up a profound question for our modern era. If the mechanics of totalitarianism rely on unseen forces, mass brainwashing, and the creation of an invisible army of blind followers, how on earth are individuals supposed to resist this today?
And that leads us right into Section 4, Breaking the Propaganda. According to the text, we can really distill the playbook of these dark forces down into 5 core tactics, and we have to understand them if we want to fight them. First, they exploit our basest, most primal desires for absolute control over others. Second, they demand blind obedience to create that invisible army we talked about. Third, they relentlessly push materialism and technological advancement at the total expense of human spiritual growth. Fourth, they manipulate political structures from the inside to ensure total domination. And fifth, they launch physical attacks through constant wars and the blatant theft of resources to enforce their will.
The author argues that recognizing this cosmic playbook is the vital first step to breaking the propaganda. The text points out that there are materialistic gods. These are forces that manipulate humanity merely through the promise of physical security, things like food, wealth, and military strength. By relying on these things, people are essentially enslaved by their own earthly needs. So the text strongly urges a fundamental shift away from this materialistic manipulation, advocating instead for a profound, independent spiritual awareness to elevate ourselves way above the trap.
Ultimately, the author's message here is a resounding call to intellectual and spiritual arms. By understanding the mechanisms of this dualistic battle, we're challenged to look critically at our own lives and our own societies. It leaves us with a provocative and honestly almost unsettling question to evaluate today. Are you actively defending your own mind, maintaining your diverse values, and resisting totalitarian groupthink? Or, without even realizing it, are you already marching with the invisible army? Thank you for joining me for this explainer.
Hey everyone, and welcome to today's explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really complex, fascinating cosmological history presented in an esoteric text by Ryuho Okawa. This whole thing is actually based on a spiritual interview that was recorded back on January 13, 2021. Whether you're already familiar with these massive theological frameworks or you're totally new to them, my goal today is to impartially guide you through the intricate universe this material presents. We're going to decode a massive cosmic hierarchy, unravel some hidden spiritual identities, and explore exactly how this text frames the ultimate battle between light and darkness.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our primary source material today is the book right here, Ryuho Okawa's Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. What makes this specific text such a compelling subject to study is how it takes ancient earthly religions and just dramatically expands them into a full-blown galactic narrative. The book basically promises to pull back the curtain, revealing the realities of dark cosmic forces and the hidden truths operating behind all of human history.
Here's our roadmap for the breakdown. 1. Zoroaster's cosmic battle. 2. The dark god Ahriman. 3. Searching for Ahura Mazda. 4. The Elohim revelation. And finally, 5. United under El Cantare.
Let's get right into it with Section 1, Zoroaster's Cosmic Battle.
So, the entire premise of this text is built upon a fundamental universe-spanning conflict. We aren't just talking about some abstract philosophical debate between good and evil here. In this framework, this is a literal, active battle between opposing spiritual forces happening across time and space. According to the text, the leader of the forces of light is Ahura Mazda. Now, historically speaking, Ahura Mazda is known as the supreme creator in Zoroastrianism, which is an ancient pre-Islamic religion of Iran. In the lore of Okawa's book, Ahura Mazda is established right from the jump as the ultimate representation of goodness, spiritual elevation, and the primary guiding force for the prophet Zoroaster on Earth.
Moving on to Section 2, the Dark God, Ahriman.
And this brilliantly illustrates the cosmic problem. Every god of light in a dualistic system needs an opposing force, right? On the left, we have Ahura Mazda, representing spiritual enlightenment and civilization. But on the right, we have Ahriman. The text completely redefines Ahriman. He isn't just a localized earthly devil, he is explicitly labeled as the dark god of the universe. The author asserts that Ahriman's influence isn't just a metaphor. It's framed as a direct, calculating intervention aimed at disrupting the forces of light and deliberately steering humanity toward materialism and totalitarianism.
Which brings us to Section 3, Searching for Ahura Mazda.
This intense cosmic standoff brings us specifically to Chapter 8 of the source material. It's titled, The Identity of the God of Light Trusted by Zoroaster. To truly understand how to fight these dark forces of Ahriman, the author initiates a state of profound spiritual meditation. The whole goal of this occult investigation is to transcend the physical realm entirely, contact the spirit of Zoroaster, and trace this lineage of light back to its ultimate source. They are literally attempting to pierce through thousands of years of human religious history to find the core truth of who is actually pulling the strings.
This leads to a moment of huge dramatic tension in the text. The interviewer is speaking with an entity representing this immense, glowing light. But a pivotal question arises. Is the ancient name Ahura Mazda the whole story? Or is it just a localized mask for a much larger cosmic player? So who is the true identity of the God of Light?
Let's find out in Section 4, the Elohim Revelation.
This brings us to a massive turning point that completely upends the traditional, historical understanding of Zoroastrianism. During this spiritual interview, the questioner directly challenges the entity they've summoned. They ask point-blank if the being they are speaking to, the exact being Zoroaster worshipped, is indeed Ahura Mazda. And the entity's response? A surprising, flat denial. The spirit dismisses the idea, essentially saying that a being of such immense, overwhelming light couldn't merely be confined to the traditional limits of Ahura Mazda.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the claim. The entity drops a complete theological bombshell within the context of the book's universe. Ahura Mazda is identified as the entity Elohim. This merges two entirely different historical religious traditions. Elohim, traditionally known as the creator god in the Middle Eastern and Judeo-Christian traditions, is revealed here to be the exact same entity as the Persian god of light, Ahura Mazda.
The interviewer is understandably pretty taken aback, but the entity doubles down, stating super clearly, it's all Elohim. Elohim uses various names. Just think about the implications of that for a second. The text is claiming that completely disparate world religions were actually being guarded by the exact same entity. Whether humanity called him Ahura Mazda in ancient Persia or the creator in the Middle East, the book asserts it was a singular, overarching entity wearing different cultural masks to guide humanity throughout history.
To further bridge this gap, the text even reinterprets Zoroastrianism's famous fire worship. It wasn't just ancient pagan ritualism. According to the spiritual interview, Elohim deliberately taught humanity the power of fire as a highly practical and spiritual tool. It was a dual force. Spiritually, it represented the power to burn away evil and disease, but practically, it was the foundational technology required to actually build human civilization and advance against the forces of darkness.
Finally, we reach Section 5, United under El-Kantare.
But the cosmological structure of this text doesn't stop with Elohim. We have to expand our lens away from earthbound history entirely and look at a vast cosmic alliance. This is where we're introduced to El-Kantare. In the universe of this text, El-Kantare is the absolute supreme cosmic deity. While Elohim is a massive, guiding force for Earth civilizations, El-Kantare's power is depicted as extending far, far beyond our planet, reaching across the universe to what the text calls the Messiah star.
So the crucial point is how these entities actually relate to one another within this cosmic alliance of saviors, all united under the supreme deity El-Kantare. We have Elohim, who operates as the god of light and fire, directly managing and guiding human history through figures like Zoroaster. But Elohim isn't the absolute top of the pyramid. Elohim's earthly guidance operates strictly under the universal supremacy of El-Kantare, the supreme source connected to the Messiah star. It's a highly structured, tiered cosmic alliance all working in tandem to combat Ahriman.
As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a thought directly inspired by the framework we just explored. This text posits a universe where human history, our religions, and even our global conflicts aren't just random events. They're surface reflections of an immense, structured cosmic battle involving entities like Elohim and Elken-Terra fighting against dark universal forces. If we look at the world through the lens of this text, if our earthly history is literally just a surface reflection of this vast cosmic alliance, how does that change the way we view global conflicts? It's a fascinating paradigm to consider for sure. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope this provided a really clear window into this complex cosmological narrative. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a framework that completely flips how we look at world events, blending modern geopolitics with, well, extraterrestrial spirituality. We are looking at a worldview that the headlines you read every single day aren't just about nations competing for resources, but are actually frontline skirmishes in a literal cosmic war. The source material we're unpacking is Ryuho Okawa's book, Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe, recorded back in January 2021. We're going to focus heavily on the pivotal Chapter 9. According to this text, global events are part of a massive battle against an entity it calls the Dark God of the Universe. We're going to figure out exactly what that means, how the text identifies this enemy, and the incredibly unique, kind of sci-fi solution it proposes for humanity.
Now get this, the core thesis here is absolutely wild. Through the lens of this book, UFO disclosure isn't just about figuring out if aliens are real. It's framed as a literal spiritual weapon. It's positioned as the ultimate maneuver to shatter a deeply entrenched earthly mindset that's supposedly holding humanity back. So what exactly is this dangerous mindset? Let's break down the enemy.
All right, let's hit Section 1, Rule of the Dark God.
To really grasp this worldview, we first have to understand who or what the ultimate enemy actually is. It's not a single country or a politician. The text points the finger at scientific materialism. That's the belief that physical matter is the only reality. And the author asserts this isn't just some philosophical debate, it's an active, manipulative ideology. It's a tool deliberately used by this dark god to blind us to broader spiritual and extraterrestrial truths. Basically, by convincing people that only what they can see and touch is real, the dark god puts a hard ceiling on human consciousness.
So this sets up an epic cosmic showdown. On one side, you have the puppets of the dark god. These are systems built on totalitarianism, strict materialism, and the unwavering belief that science is omnipotent. On the other side, you've got the forces of light, championing spiritual awakening, extraterrestrial awareness, and the pursuit of cosmic truth. The author is essentially dropping every global movement into one of these two cosmic buckets.
Moving right along to Section 2, Earthly and Environmental Manipulation.
Okay, so the text brings this abstract philosophy right down to earth, making really specific claims about how this materialist agenda is playing out right now in modern environmental and geopolitical movements. The author looks at real-world figures and applies this cosmic filter to them. For example, it specifically mentions climate activist Greta Thunberg. Now, regardless of your personal stance on climate change, what's fascinating here is how this specific framework views her influence, retroactively applying a cosmic narrative to modern environmentalism.
Through Okawa's lens, mainstream environmental messaging gets framed radically differently. The text literally asserts that broadcasting climate alarmism is the work of the dark god. Why? Well, because, according to the author, it pushes the propaganda that science is omnipotent and hyper-focuses humanity purely on physical elements, like CO2 destroying the physical Earth, instead of spiritual salvation or cosmic realities. It's viewed as brainwashing to enforce that scientific materialism we just talked about.
And it doesn't stop at environmentalism. The exact same logic is applied to global economics. Geopolitical power plays, specifically calling out China's economic expansion and initiatives like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are viewed through this same lens. They aren't just economic strategies, they're seen as physical manifestations of this materialist control system. So chasing purely material wealth and dominance is, in this framework, just a different tentacle of the same dark god.
Which brings us to Section 3, UFOs as the counter-strategy.
If materialism is the ultimate trap, if believing only in the physical world is the problem, then how do you break it? You have to introduce something that completely shatters that reality. And the book proposes an incredibly unique solution. The text actually cites former U.S. President Donald Trump's administration, specifically the military declassification of UFO videos, as a massive strategic turning point in this cosmic war.
The author insists this disclosure wasn't some random bureaucratic accident, it was a deliberate leak. The book even claims that America is actively receiving technological support from extraterrestrials to maintain a military edge against those materialist totalitarian regimes. This disclosure is designed to directly blow up the materialist narrative of the world.
But obviously, this is high stakes. The book points out that past leaders who attempted to expose this extraterrestrial reality faced severe threats. It suggests the forces of the dark god are so desperate to keep the illusion of a purely material world intact that historical attempts at UFO disclosure were met with extreme pushback, including the very real threat of assassination.
So here is the text's proposed playbook for humanity's victory. It's a three-step process to break the dark god's rule. Step 1. Society has to broadly acknowledge the existence of UFOs. Step 2. Humanity must accept the reality of an extraterrestrial presence. And step 3, which is absolutely crucial, we must realize that our current physical science cannot explain everything. Once you hit step 3, boom, scientific materialism crumbles.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 4, dismantling scientific materialism.
This brings us to the ultimate goal outlined in Chapter 9. It's not about winning a local election or even conquering a country. It is about the complete collapse of a worldview. The author emphasizes that fighting political figures or nations physically just doesn't cut it. If you defeat a dictator, but the people still believe only in material power, you haven't actually won anything. A new dictator will just pop up because the underlying ideology, the actual power source of the dark god, is still there.
Think about the difference here. The physical war is about defeating specific leaders or nations. But the spiritual war is about using undeniable paradigm-shifting events like massive UFO disclosure to completely collapse that materialistic ideology. Destroying a physical regime does nothing if the materialist thought remains. So, proving the existence of highly advanced spiritual extraterrestrials becomes the ultimate ideological weapon to free the human mind.
It is a completely wild, expansive way to read the morning news, isn't it? To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. How does viewing modern geopolitics and environmentalism through a cosmic, extraterrestrial lens fundamentally change our understanding of global events? Whether you see this text as literal truth, modern mythology, or a really complex political allegory, it absolutely forces us to question the philosophies driving the actions of nations today. Thanks for joining me to unpack this source material. Stay curious, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're unpacking a highly unique, provocative spiritual text recorded on January 13th, 2021, titled Zoroaster, How to Fight the Dark God of the Universe. Now, you should know up front, this isn't your standard historical biography. It's actually presented as a channeled spiritual message that claims to reveal the hidden cosmic forces driving all the chaos in our modern world. Right off the bat, the premise sets a massive stage. According to the author Ryuho Okawa, we aren't just dealing with run-of-the-mill earthly politics or standard human conflicts. No, this book asserts that we are actively engaged in a massive, unseen cosmic battle against dark forces. It's a bold, highly controversial claim for sure, and our goal for this explainer is to objectively map out exactly how this text constructs its argument. To navigate all these complex claims, we've got a clear map. First, we'll look at the ultimate cosmic battle. Second, Ahriman's earthly interventions. Third, politics and spiritual warfare. And finally, the final spiritual message.
All right, starting with part 1, the ultimate cosmic battle, or the ancient war of light and dark.
And this brilliantly illustrates the foundation of it all. To understand the book's claims about our modern world, we really have to look backward to ancient Zoroastrian dualism. So on one side, we have the forces of the light god, identified here as Ahura Mazda, who represents faith, human freedom, and spiritual elevation. Pitted against him is the dark god, Ahriman, whose entire domain is strict materialism, totalitarianism, and absolute control. The text essentially argues that every major human struggle is, at its core, a proxy war between these two exact forces. It's like a giant cosmic chess match. Now, you might be thinking of Zoroaster as just some ancient historical figure who lived thousands of years ago, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The text posits that the spirit of Zoroaster is an active, ongoing spiritual force that is literally continuing to battle this cosmic darkness today. In fact, he is framed as the channeled voice delivering these very modern warnings. The text makes a really interesting theological move here by unifying global religions. It explicitly identifies the light god, Ahura Mazda, with Elohim, the God of the Old Testament. By doing this, the author is attempting to unite totally different spiritual traditions into a single, unified front against ultimate cosmic evil.
Moving on to Section 2, Ahriman's earthly interventions, focusing on the tactics of the Dark God. So if this ancient war is real, how is it playing out on Earth right now? Honestly, that is the million-dollar question the text tries to answer. How does an ancient, dark, cosmic entity actually intervene in modern, everyday human affairs? Well, the crucial mechanism here is the concept of a walk-in. The text defines a walk-in as a spiritual possession, or the intense psychological influence of an earthly leader by a dark extraterrestrial or spiritual entity. The book uses this esoteric concept to explain those sudden extreme shifts toward authoritarianism or cruelty that we've seen in powerful human leaders throughout history. The text gets super specific about Ahriman's earthly tactics. It directly attributes the rise of major totalitarian regimes, like the Soviet Union or the Nazis, to this dark influence. It also claims that an over-reliance on science and technology is actually a deliberate tactic designed to replace faith in God. It even goes so far as to claim that dark forces are actively orchestrating extraterrestrial genetic hybridization just to erase our spiritual awareness entirely. The author structures these arguments by explicitly linking historical political movements to the cosmos. The text contrasts the ideals of democracy against the ideologies of the French Revolution and modern totalitarianism, basically framing them as direct physical manifestations of this unseen war between light and dark. Which brings us to Section 3, Politics and Spiritual Warfare, looking at modern events through a cosmic lens. Here's where it gets really relatable to our daily newsfeed. The text views everyday political discourse not just as regular human debate, but as literal spiritual warfare. Modern geopolitics, media narratives, and even contemporary environmental movements are seen as active battlegrounds for dominance over human consciousness. It's a total paradigm shift in how to read the news. It is absolutely fascinating to see how the book brings ancient theology crashing into modern times. The text analyzes contemporary figures like Donald Trump and climate activist Greta Thunberg, and incredibly, even integrates modern USO phenomena right into its theological framework, interpreting the whole thing through the lens of Zoroastrian dualism. Now, what's really interesting here is the book's assertion that mass media networks and public icons are particularly vulnerable to manipulation by these materialistic, dark entities. The argument is that by controlling the media narrative and shaping public idols, these cosmic forces can steer humanity away from spiritual truths and push us deeper and deeper into material dependency. Finally, let's look at Section 4. The final spiritual message, specifically focusing on Chapter 10, Confronting the Darkness. This brings us to Chapter 10, which is the climax of the book and actually finishes the recording of Zoroaster's spiritual message. The text culminates in a massive call to action. It argues that humanity is definitely not defenseless against these interventions. In fact, it claims that the mere act of revealing these hidden cosmic truths, basically bringing them into the light, is our primary weapon against the darkness. The whole shebang boils down to this emphatic quote: "Sharing these cosmic revelations is absolutely necessary to confront evil, protect human freedom, and defend faith." This isn't just an informational text. It genuinely positions itself as a literal tool for spiritual defense. So, practically speaking, how does humanity fight back in this framework? Well, it starts by recognizing that there is a spiritual reality driving material events. From there, you must actively reject totalitarianism and forced materialism, strongly defend faith and individual liberty, and ultimately spread this spiritual awareness to others to break the dark god's dominance. To put it simply, within the context of this book, ignorance is exactly what allows darkness to thrive, and cosmic awareness is what guarantees human freedom. By understanding the cosmic game being played out above us, humanity reclaims its free will down below. Whether you view this as literal truth or just fascinating fringe sociology, it really shows how people use the esoteric to make sense of a chaotic modern world. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. If our earthly, political, and social struggles are truly the manifestations of an ancient cosmic war, is our ultimate defense entirely spiritual rather than physical? It's a completely mind-bending framework for viewing the chaos of the world today. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Explainer.